Hey everybody, welcome to IS 326 Module 3. This is the lecture on regional cooperation and integration in Africa. And yes, I'm aware I don't look an awful lot like Dr. Romuald Afat Chow. He's my colleague here at the Martin Institute. I'm the director of the Institute in Program International Studies. And he and I collaborated to build IS 325 and IS 326 several years ago. And as we've revised the classes over the years, we still maintain a toehold in the other's class because we want to introduce the other to our students and to sort of integrate the way we teach here at the Martin Institute. One of the things I do and teach and study is international organizations, international governmental and international non-governmental organizations, and how they sort of bridge countries together through voluntary associations primarily, but sometimes not so voluntary, as we'll see here in the lecture. Africa is one of those places where intergovernmental organizations and this collaboration across countries and cultures has been relatively successful, certainly one that's been desirable from the point of view of the participants since they became independent. So that's what we're going to talk about today and see how it all fits together as we go through. All right, sovereignty versus benefits. This is a concept that I harp on a lot in the IS 310 class. That's a class about the United Nations. It's the idea that you take your right to do whatever it is that you want to do. That's setting postal rates, that's overhunting your own populations, it's agriculture policy, it's water policy, it's all those sorts of things. And you have the right to do it. And if you're interested in doing so, you trade some of that right, that sovereign right, the sovereignty, to other states via an intergovernmental organization. In other words, that's an organization made up of by other states, and there's some sort of perceived benefit. So if you want to conserve your elephant population instead of hunting them into oblivion, then you might trade that right, but you get support in the form of money and expertise that comes in from the intergovernmental organization. So you trade that sovereign right, but you get something in return. And so there's sort of an ongoing dialogue about whether it's worth it to join these intergovernmental organizations. And so for Africa, as they became African states, as they became independent, starting in 1957, they became possessed of this right. They had the ability to exercise the right to do whatever it is they wanted to do. Now, that's limited by your own internal power and your organization and your politics, your society and your economy, and whether the states around you are stable, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of things that limit it, but that idea of trading the sovereignty for benefits is one that appeals to states. Now, one of the things that is true across the world is that smaller states, newer states, states with less capital, states with weak human capital, with educated workforce, lots of different skill sets, states who are in regions that don't have a lot of stability and ability in and of themselves, there's sort of a perception that larger states might have more to lose if they trade sovereignty for benefits. They might have to trade more sovereignty for the same amount of benefits that a small state does. So it's well and good for a state like Zambia or Zimbabwe to say, yes, we declare ourselves a nuclear-free zone. We will not have nuclear weapons if they don't have the technical expertise to develop nuclear weapons, right? So they can give up, quote unquote, give up the sovereign right to develop their own nuclear weapons that they're currently incapable of developing for the benefit of joining an intergovernmental organization governing nuclear material. It's called the International Atomic Energy Agency through the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But if you're a larger state like South Africa or the United States or India, then you might not want to make that exchange because you do or you may have the ability to develop those weapons for yourselves. So a large state that has capacity may be more hesitant to join these smaller organizations, whereas the African states that are smaller would say, yes, this is a good idea for us because we're going to struggle to exercise all of the sovereignty on our own. So there might be more benefits in joining these organizations. It's not true across the board. It doesn't make them enthusiastic all over the place. It's going to be pretty cautious in the negotiation, but the argument is that it makes them willing. And so in Africa's case, right from the beginning of the decolonization era, there's conversations about what kinds of intergovernmental organizations to join. As states became independent, right, they have this conversation. So you start from 1955, you got about 4 independent states. 57, the 1st of January 57 is when Ghana becomes independent under the guidance of Kwame Nkrumah, pictured here on this cover of Time magazine. There's conversations about what kind of organization there should be. Emergent states, they look for emergent alliances. Now, they don't really leave much room for formal alliances. They're talking about formal alliances, but they're not sure. For example, Kwame Nkrumah proposes at different times all of West Africa as a superstate that as they became independent, they would immediately join. There's a lot of distrust and mistrust there from historical reasons, so they don't want to trade that much sovereignty to have a formal state that would have stretched basically from Ghana to Mali. So they don't go that way. He says there should maybe be a Pan-African organization, all of African states being allied in some way. They recognize they need something, but they're not sure exactly what it should be, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. What is immediately clear is that there's an organization that is dedicated on the global level to help the African states transition from colonialism to independence. It's called the UN Trusteeship Council. It's one of the main bodies set out by the UN Charter, which is negotiated and signed in 1945. Decolonization is one of the main commitments in the UN Charter, and they were serious about it, and they went through this process. So the idea was that there would be these people who would come in from outside and help you transition, because the decolonization process doesn't function equally across the continent, or indeed across the world when people became independent. Um, some of the colonial powers would help set up interim governments and help transition the process, and some would basically take all the good stuff and blow up the bridges as they left. And so some states had more of a trouble transition to independence than others. So the Trusteeship Council is supposed to help you in that interim. Now, they're not always seen particularly positively because, they sort of see it in some states as neocolonial, right? There's wise men coming from outside, sort of repeated the pattern from before. But in some cases, the system worked quite well. In others, it didn't. What you did have was an intergovernmental organization designed specifically at the time to help African states. It then goes on to help Asian states, Pacific states, Caribbean states, etc. But this idea from the UN Trusteeship Council. So that one sort of comes in from the outside, but where they're going to go from inside to join outside, there's a whole host of these, a search for affiliations. Now, the UN itself isn't pictured on here. You've got that logo on the previous page. The UN is the first place they want to affiliate with, right? The UN is the biggest, largest, most well-known of the intergovernmental organizations. And one of the things that's key about it is it grants universal recognition. If you get recognition as an independent state from the United Nations, then it transports from one state to all states. So basically what happens is this: you can declare independence. Any entity can say we're an independent entity, and there's a whole bunch of microstates all over the world. So you can do that, but it doesn't mean that you have recognition from anyone else. You can just say you've done it, and there's any level of sort of one-off recognitions around the world. For example, Somalia currently has a sub-entity called Somaliland that's in the north and northwest of the country. And Somaliland says it's independent from Somalia. That doesn't make it so. What they would need to make it so is to go for approval to both the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And if you pass both of those bodies, then you get a global recognition by being part of the United Nations. So that's the first place that the African states want to appeal to, because they want to be recognized as independent entities. They don't just want to declare themselves independent, right? So the UN's the first one, but it's not by no means the only one. A close second is actually FIFA. And we'll talk more in the last unit of the course about sports and national unity and the idea of this sort of recognition on another level, on the playing field, actually, and what it means. So later in the course, we'll talk about that. That's one of the places looking for recognition. If you can have a national soccer team, then you probably have a nation, goes the argument. Sorry, I forgot to turn off my email program, so it's going to beep through there. Then there is this idea here, this embodied by this flag here in the top left. It's the Organization of African Unity. This is Nkrumah's idea, right? He's going to push for something. And they meet in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. They're talking about how to set it up. And one of the key things is to look at that name, the Organization of African Unity. It's not a union like the European Union or the modern day African Union. They're not going to unify to do everything. They're going to try and do something through collaboration and common interest. They're going to do unity sort of projects. There's some stuff that's binding, but they decide not to trade sovereignty by and large to this organization because they just wanted to work to common purposes. And part of that's because of what you see in these other things, like this symbol here and this symbol here. They're representative of the Commonwealth of Nations that's in the top right. That's countries that are culturally affiliated through former presence in the British Empire, and the Organization of the Francophone World, which is that multicolored one down there in the middle. which is from affiliation from being former French colonies. That's one of the levels of division. There's also Lusophone colonies, which are Portuguese. There's a couple of Spanish states, a couple of former German states. There's the former Belgian states in the center of the continent. There's the Arab states across the north. There's a lot of cultural reasons why they don't want to become formally unified. And so they have the unity, right? African unity. And then you have these other two organizations here, this G77, which is there in the top middle, and the non-aligned movement, which is in the bottom left. The non-aligned movement has always that really weird logo to me that looks at one glance like a hand grenade, which is actually a globe, and a dove with a nice sprig of something, some sort of plant matter. So these come out of a desire to try and work through the United Nations in a collaborative fashion. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The G77 starts as a group of 77 states. There's now about 140 states who are sort of partnering to sort of combine their smaller political presences to do something larger. The non-aligned movement is actually another thing that comes out of Africa in the 1950s. It's Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt comes with this idea of being non-aligned, in other words, not being in either the U.S. orbit or the Soviet orbit. They'll be in a non-aligned orbit, the third orbit, which is actually where you get the phrase third world from, which we don't use a lot anymore, but that's where it came from. U.S. first world, Soviet Union second world, NAM third world. And so these are places where they're going to try and collaborate as blocks at the United Nations and other places. Well, the UN is actually still involved, as you might imagine. Sorry about that. The main areas is UN peacekeeping, which is the blue helmets there. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which acts anytime there's civil war or famine. And the World Food Program, which has standing warehouses and is trying to provide food security. Peacekeeping is the most visible of these, both visible because it has success in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia, and horrible failures like in Rwanda and also in Sierra Leone earlier when they had some trouble with rebel groups and things. So you've got these visible entities of the UN. There's 40 or 50 different agencies that are involved, but these are the main ones. But the relative influence in the UN has definitely changed over time. So here is a very brief chart. Obviously, there's only three pods here. So you're looking at sort of what Africa looked at in the UN when the organization was founded in 1945, 4 independent African states, and 7.8% of the total. There's a lot of states become independent. You can see that, or are independent and join the UN. In the ensuing 10 years, that's 27 new states. It drops the ability of African influence decisions down, but that's really changed in the interim. And actually, these numbers are 54, 192, and 27.9% since South Sudan has joined in the interim. Relative influence in the Security Council, there's not much influence for Africa. They have 3 seats out of 15, which sounds good, but there's variable power of the different seats in the Security Council, so they don't have a lot of influence. But in bodies where one country equals one vote, the relative power of Africa has changed as they affiliate in and through the UN. So if you coordinate your votes through the OAU, or through the African Union, or through NAM, or through G77, then controlling essentially 28% of the votes in the General Assembly or the Economic and Social Council is important, and it helps Africa have more ability to wield its sovereignty, to wield its influence than it would if they stayed on their own. And over time, you have had, in the last 15 years or so, an expansion of the effectiveness and of the integration of different African organizations. So we transitioned in the late 90s from the OAU of African Unity, Organization of African Unity, to the AU, the African Union, because there is a desire to get more closely affiliated. So you've expanded that regional organization. There's sub-regional organizations like the Economic Community of West African States. It's a really interesting IGO that is obviously in West Africa that does some interesting things. There's COMESA in the south. There's several organizations in the east. And in the north, there's several sub-regional organizations as well. So you shouldn't just stick with the big one. There's also regional organizations designed to do things like promote development with 50-year and 100-year plans. That's NEPID. You've got an article on that, so I won't belabor it much. But here's the basic idea, is you've got the African states. There's 54 of them independent. They have limited power on their own. So there's a desire in Africa to both affiliate within the continent, and so that was the OAU, now the African Union, its sub-regional organizations. It's the idea of trading their individual right to do whatever it is they want for a pooled resource that gets them a benefit back. And these exist across the board, and they're very important. So if you understand this trend in Africa to see how it can influence things beyond its borders or within its borders more strongly than they could otherwise, this will be good for you to recognize this pattern and always know that Africa's thinking and figuring out how to hold its place in the world.